Deep in the scorched, unforgiving expanse of the American Southwest, a wild and volatile force of nature spent millions of years carving through solid volcanic rock. The Colorado River was a notoriously unpredictable beast, prone to devastating spring floods that wiped out entire farming communities, followed by late summer droughts that baked the earth to dust. To stand on the precipice of Black Canyon in the early 20th century was to look down into a terrifying abyss of churning, silt-choked water. Yet where a casual observer saw only raw, untamable wilderness, a daring coalition of visionary engineers saw an unprecedented opportunity to halt a river in its tracks. The timing of this audacious endeavor could not have been more dramatically poignant. As the stock market collapsed and the Great Depression plunged the nation into an era of profound economic despair, millions of Americans found themselves stripped of their livelihoods and their dignity. The promise of a colossal public works project in the Nevada desert became a beacon of desperate hope. Entire families packed whatever belongings they had left into dilapidated jalopies, migrating toward an entirely unforgiving environment simply for the chance to swing a hammer or pour cement. They were not merely seeking wages, they were searching for salvation in the shadow of a monumental undertaking. The monumental task of transforming this desperate labor force into an army of builders fell to Frank Crow, a brilliant and notoriously driven engineer. Crow had spent his entire career mastering the art of moving earth and water, but the Hoover Dam was the ultimate test of his formidable skills. Representing a massive consortium of construction firms known as Six Companies, Crow approached the canyon with a staggering level of logistical genius. He envisioned not just a concrete wall, but a perfectly choreographed symphony of men, machines, and materials operating relentlessly around the clock. When the first waves of workers arrived to begin construction from 1931 to 1936, the reality of their new environment proved to be a brutal shock. The canyon was a natural oven where summer temperatures routinely soared above 120 degrees Fahrenheit, turning the sheer rock walls into radiating heat sinks. There was no shade, no respite, and initially, no infrastructure to support the thousands of men who pitched their ragged tents on the rocky canyon floor. The environment itself was actively hostile to human life, fiercely resisting every attempt to impose order upon it. High above the churning river, the most harrowing work belonged to the high scalers. These daring men were suspended from the canyon rim by single ropes, dangling hundreds of feet in the air with nothing but a leather harness between them and certain death. Armed with jackhammers and dynamite, their job was to strip the canyon walls of loose rock to expose the solid bedrock necessary to anchor the massive structure. They swung like human pendulums across the sheer cliffs, dodging falling boulders and errant explosions in a daily dance with mortality that claimed far too many lives. Before a single ounce of concrete could be poured for the dam itself, engineers faced a seemingly impossible paradox. You cannot build a massive foundation in the middle of a raging, flood-prone river. The entire Colorado River had to be temporarily moved out of its ancient bed. This required an engineering feat that, on its own, rivaled the most ambitious projects of the era. The plan was to bore 4 massive diversion tunnels straight through the solid canyon walls, 2 on the Nevada side and 2 on the Arizona side, to bypass the construction site entirely. Blasting these tunnels was a descent into a subterranean hell. Workers mounted dozens of heavy pneumatic drills onto massive multi-tiered platforms called jumbo rigs, backing them up to the rock face to drill holes for dynamite. Once the explosive charges were set, the rigs retreated. The earth shook with the deafening force of the blast, and teams rushed back in to clear the shattered rock. These tunnels were not mere pipes. They were caverns 56 feet in diameter, large enough to easily accommodate a commercial airplane, carved through some of the hardest rock on the continent. Inside these dark, suffocating shafts, the human cost of the project began to mount with terrifying speed. The gasoline-powered trucks used to haul away the blasted rock filled the poorly ventilated tunnels with lethal carbon monoxide. Men collapsed in the stifling, dust-choked darkness, suffering from severe heat exhaustion and poisonous fumes. The official records often attributed these deaths to pneumonia, a grim bureaucratic sleight of hand that masked the brutal reality of the subterranean conditions. The relentless pace set by the contractors was literally working men to death. The breaking point arrived in the sweltering summer of 1931. Pushed to their physical and psychological limits by the deadly tunnel conditions and a sudden wage cut, the workers laid down their tools and went on strike. They demanded ice water, better ventilation, and an end to the brutal employment practices that treated human lives as expendable commodities. It was a desperate stand by desperate men, a clash between the raw vulnerability of the labor force and the immense power of the corporate consortium. Frank Crowe's response to the strike was ruthlessly pragmatic and deeply indicative of the era's harsh realities. Knowing that thousands of unemployed men were waiting just outside the canyon, eager to take the strikers' places, he simply fired the entire workforce and ordered them out of the camps. The crushing economic pressure of the Great Depression left the workers with no leverage. Within days, the strike collapsed. The men returned to the deadly tunnels under the same grueling conditions, and the relentless march of progress resumed without missing a beat. Despite the staggering toll, the diversion tunnels were finally completed. In a moment of profound triumph, massive earthen cofferdams were constructed across the river, violently forcing the muddy waters of the Colorado into the man-made caverns. For the first time in millions of years, a section of the Black Canyon riverbed was exposed to the harsh desert sun. It was a surreal, awe-inspiring sight, a muddy, scarred trench where a mighty river had once roared, now waiting to receive the foundation of the greatest structure the world had ever seen. But the exposed riverbed revealed yet another monumental challenge. The bedrock necessary to support the unimaginable weight of the dam was buried beneath decades of accumulated silt, mud, and loose gravel. Armies of steam shovels and thousands of men descended into the muck, excavating millions of cubic yards of debris. They dug down, sometimes over 100 feet below the original riverbed, until they finally struck the solid, unyielding volcanic rock that could shoulder the burden of the colossal concrete wedge. With the bedrock exposed, the actual construction of the dam could begin. But this presented the most complex chemical and thermal puzzle of the entire project. If engineers simply poured the massive volume of concrete required into a single monolithic mold, the chemical reaction of the curing cement would generate enormous amounts of heat. Calculations showed it would take 125 years for the structure to cool naturally, and the resulting thermal expansion and contraction would cause the dam to crack and crumble under the pressure of the river. To solve this fatal thermal problem, engineers devised an incredibly elegant and innovative system. Instead of a single pour, the dam was built as a series of interlocking trapezoidal columns, like a massive three-dimensional puzzle. Furthermore, they embedded over 500 miles of 1-inch steel pipes throughout these concrete blocks. A massive refrigeration plant capable of producing 1,000 tons of ice every single day was built on the canyon rim. This plant pumped frigid water through the embedded pipes, artificially cooling the curing concrete and extracting the immense heat from the core of the structure. The sheer scale of the concrete operation defies modern comprehension. Giant buckets, each holding 8 cubic yards of wet concrete and weighing over 20 tons, were swung out over the canyon on a complex network of aerial cableways. These buckets were lowered into the wooden forms, dumped by a single operator, and then whisked back to the mixing plants in a matter of seconds. Day and night, without pause, the canyon echoed with the roar of machinery as bucket after bucket was poured, slowly raising the massive artificial mountain block by interlocking block. The aerial cableways that spanned the canyon were a marvel of industrial choreography. They were the mechanical arteries of the project, capable of delivering immense loads with pinpoint accuracy to any location within the vast construction zone. High up in control booths perched on the canyon rim, operators relied on telephones and hand signals to maneuver the giant buckets through the complex web of steel cables. It was a high-stakes mechanical ballet where a single miscalculation could send tons of material crashing down onto the men working furiously below. Down in the forms, the concrete crews worked with frantic precision. As soon as a bucket dumped its heavy load, men in rubber boots waded into the thick gray sludge. They wielded heavy pneumatic vibrators, plunging them into the wet concrete to force out air bubbles and ensure the material settled tightly against the wooden forms and the embedded cooling pipes. It was exhausting, back-breaking labor, performed in a deafening environment of roaring engines and shouting foremen, requiring intense focus to avoid being buried or crushed by the relentless machinery. As the individual columns of concrete cooled and contracted, tiny gaps inevitably formed between the massive blocks. To transform this segmented puzzle into a single, impenetrable shield against the river, engineers pumped a specialized grout, a thin mixture of cement and water, under immense pressure into these microscopic fissures. This grouting process fused the individual columns together, creating a truly monolithic arch-gravity structure that derived its strength not just from its massive weight, but by transferring the immense pressure of the water into the solid rock walls of the canyon itself. Slowly, relentlessly, the stark white face of the dam rose from the depths of the canyon, a stunning geometric contrast to the jagged natural rock. When the final bucket of concrete was poured, the structure stood a staggering 726 feet tall, a sheer concrete cliff that permanently altered the geography of the American Southwest. It was a moment of profound visual triumph. The wild, unpredictable river had been walled off, replaced by a sweeping, elegant curve of human engineering that dominated the landscape. Yet, holding back the river was only half the objective. The true purpose of the dam was to harness that immense stored energy. To generate hydroelectric power, engineers had to safely route the massive volume of water from the newly forming reservoir through the dam and into the powerhouses below. This required the construction of penstocks, massive steel pipes designed to handle the terrifying kinetic energy of water falling from hundreds of feet above. The pressure inside these tubes would be immense, requiring steel plates up to nearly 3 inches thick. The penstock pipes were so incomprehensibly large, some measuring 30 feet in diameter, that they could not be transported by any existing train or truck network. The solution was as audacious as the dam itself. A complete steel fabrication plant was constructed right on the canyon rim. Here, massive flat plates of steel were rolled into enormous cylinders and welded together using cutting-edge X-ray technology to ensure every seam was flawless. These colossal steel rings were then carefully lowered into the canyon by the cableways and painstakingly welded into continuous conduits. Deep within the U-shaped powerhouses nestled at the base of the dam, the true heart of the machine was installed. Massive turbines, spun by the terrifying force of the water rushing through the penstocks, were connected to colossal generators. These spinning magnetic leviathans transformed the raw kinetic energy of the falling river into an invisible, surging current of electricity. It was an alchemical transformation on an industrial scale, turning the ancient, destructive power of the floods into the vital lifeblood of modern civilization. The defining moment of closure arrived when the heavy steel gates of the diversion tunnels were finally slammed shut. Behind the towering concrete wall, the mighty Colorado River began to back up, slowly drowning the canyons and valleys upstream to form Lake Mead, the largest reservoir in the United States by volume. The muddy, turbulent waters grew still and deep, storing years of potential drought relief and flood control behind millions of tons of concrete. The river had been completely and utterly subjugated. The completion of this colossal project fundamentally permanently altered the trajectory of the American West. The reliable supply of water and the massive infusion of cheap hydroelectric power fueled an unprecedented era of expansion. It allowed sprawling agricultural empires to bloom in the arid deserts of California and Arizona. It provided the vital energy necessary to transform a dusty railroad stop called Las Vegas into a glowing metropolis of neon. And it fueled the explosive, unbridled growth of Los Angeles into a global economic powerhouse. But this monumental leap forward was purchased at a staggering human cost. Officially, nearly 100 workers died directly on the project from falls, falling rock, heavy machinery accidents, and dynamite explosions. Countless others succumbed to the brutal heat or the insidious effects of carbon monoxide poisoning in the early tunnel days, deaths often scrubbed from the official record. The dam is a marvel of concrete and steel, but it is also a somber mausoleum, forever shadowed by the sacrifices of the desperate men who risked everything to build it. For Frank Crowe, the completion of the project was the crowning achievement of a legendary career. Through relentless drive, brilliant logistical planning, and a ruthless commitment to efficiency, he had guided his army of workers to finish the massive structure more than 2 years ahead of schedule and well under the federal budget. He had looked into the terrifying void of the canyon and successfully orchestrated the most complex construction project in human history up to that point, cementing his legacy as a titan of American engineering. Standing before the sweeping, monolithic face of the dam today, it is impossible not to feel a profound sense of awe at the sheer audacity of its creators. It stands as a physical manifestation of resilience, a towering monument to a generation that refused to be broken by the crushing despair of the Great Depression. They took the raw materials of the earth, mixed them with sweat, ingenuity, and blood, and forged a structure that will likely outlast the very civilization that built it. The Hoover Dam remains an enduring masterpiece of human will. It is a testament to the belief that with enough vision, courage, and collective effort, even the most formidable forces of nature can be tamed and harnessed for the greater good. As the massive turbines continue their silent, relentless spin deep within the canyon walls, they whisper the story of the men who conquered the river, a story of staggering sacrifice, brilliant innovation, and the unyielding human desire to shape the future.